Our keynote speaker today on day 2 is Dr. Julia Adler-Milstein. She is an associate professor at the School of Information and the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. She leads the Lab for Health IT Impact. Dr. Adler-Milstein is internationally recognized as an expert on policy and management issues related to the use of IT in healthcare delivery. Her research assesses the progress of health IT adoption, the impact of such adoption on healthcare costs and quality, and the relationships between market, organizational, and team structure and health IT use. We would encourage you to ask questions during the presentation through Twitter. Please tweet at ConnectingMish to ask a question, and after the conference, we will post a Q&A video of Dr. Adler-Milstein answering your questions. So here to talk about a new look at economic barriers to interoperability, Dr. Julia Adler-Milstein.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your story. It's, someone who doesn't even know either of you, it was very moving to hear that, and I think, you're about to get a little bit of altitude sickness because you're gonna go from that very personal patient level up to a very 30,000-foot view of some of these issues, and in some ways that's what makes this topic remarkable, is that we're doing that, all day, every day. We have to think about the big picture policy issues, getting the incentives right, as I'll talk about, getting the technology right, but also thinking about what is that very individual impact that we have through our work. So again, just thank you for that. I'm really honored to be here today and to be able to share some of my research and some of the insights that come from it. I have to admit that actually the hardest part of putting this talk together today was the title. I ended up going with the most vanilla choice, but I want to tell you what the other two choices were. One of them was health information exchange and incentives, the end of the Kumbaya era. I think we are really at the end of the era where, and again, partly it comes from the fact that we're here and we all want to do good in the sense that sort of, the healthcare delivery system should fall in line behind those good intentions. But we've had, I think, enough experience with sort of how far Kumbaya gets you, and it's not gotten us to the finish line. And so now it is, I think, time to take a new look at incentives and what we need to do to really get us moving a little bit faster towards the end goal of being able to seamlessly share information in ways that impact patient care. So that was one of the options. The other title option was Michigan is awesome. And it's really because I think we are one of the few states that has really been thinking about incentives from day one and designed our approach to HIE with incentives in mind. And I think that is a model for the rest of the country and something that everyone in this room should feel really proud of. And I think it started with an early recognition of getting the payers on board, and the panel yesterday, I think, addressed that very directly. And that, in some of my early work, we did some cost-benefit modeling around what would be the impact of nationwide interoperability. And we came up with a very big number, and I think it led to a lot of excitement around the potential for interoperability. But sort of the second most important finding there was this misalignment of who pays and who benefits. And this recognition that the people who pay for care are the ones who should benefit from interoperability, yet they are not the ones that need to do, implement the technical infrastructure and make data move from point A to point B. And so the fact that payers are coming to the table in the state and being willing to support HIE, I think is really huge, and again, a lesson that I think the rest of the country is perhaps starting to recognize, but certainly behind where we are in Michigan. So now that you know sort of the options for my titles, you might feel a little disappointed with what I picked, but I think it does connote what I hope to do today, which is to give you some sense of what we've learned about incentives and some of the economic barriers to interoperability, as well as then think about what are the implications for the path forward. So again, I think this is familiar to most everyone in the room, but recognition that what we're trying to work on here is really critical to a well-functioning healthcare system, and that we need to be able to share data in order for providers to make effective decisions. But increasingly, we need to share data for a lot of other reasons, including population health and other approaches in which we need to be able to aggregate data beyond the individual patient. I think the real challenge is not whether we need to do this, but how do we do it? What are the actual approaches that are going to get us there? And we're trying a lot of different things in this country and trying to then learn from that experience. What is the approach or set of approaches that's going to get us there? I think high tech was a very big experiment in one approach to drive interoperability. And I'm going to, I think, help show some data to help think about ways in which it's been successful and ways in which it's still not quite gotten us there. But again, it's given us a lot to learn from and reflect on as we think about what the next era in progressing health IT, and in particular interoperable health IT, will look like. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there's frustration with the slow pace of progress on interoperability. And I think there was a sense that, well, once we put in systems, then the information will start to flow. And there was not really recognition of the fact that those are very separate problems, getting the systems in place and then figuring out how to not only move the information, but get it to be usable. And so I think this sort of idea that in a period of 5 to 6 years after high tech, we were going to have a fully interoperable health information infrastructure was probably not the right set of expectations to go into this with. So some of this is expectations adjustment, but some of this is the fact that these activities moving towards more interoperability is valuable, and we need that value today. And so we do need to figure out how to speed up progress. So I'm a researcher, I'm going to show you some data, so I know it's early, but bear with me. So, I think when we look at some of the data from high tech, and as I suspect most of you know in the meaningful use framework, the primary criteria related to a health information exchange was transmitting summary of care records when patients make transitions across care settings. And again, as I think all of us in this room recognize, interoperability is hard. Moving information between distinct organizations is hard. But if you look at the data from 2013 to 2014, and this is among all US hospitals, and you say, which criteria did hospitals make the most progress on in terms of their readiness to engage in that criteria? The two that were at the top of the list were actually the HIE criteria. The summary care record for each transition in 2013, about 40% of hospitals were ready to do that. In 2015, that jumped up to 75%. That is a huge increase at the national level to say that many hospitals in 1 year were able to get ready to do something that I think we can all agree is pretty complex. And actually, even above that was the patient engagement in HIE via being able to view, download, and transfer their information. And that jumped from 10% in 2013 to almost 65%. So if you say, was high tech effective in getting hospitals to sort of engage in interoperability to a higher level? I think the answer is undoubtedly yes, right? And that's just 1 year gains. I think we've seen even increased progress after that. This was the year sort of right before stage 2 was going to kick in, so I think that was partly why we saw this big jump. But anyway, I think, again, the numbers really paint a picture of remarkable progress in just 1 year. But, there's always a but. If you then actually look at the data to say, well, at what level were they engaging in these criteria, and this is the data for the stage 2 transition of care, the threshold to meet the measure was 10%. For 10% of transitions of care, you needed to electronically transmit a summary of care record. And what you can see from this data is that the majority of hospitals were pretty close to the threshold, either in the 10 to 20% bucket or the 20 to 30% bucket. The average in this data is around, I think in the mid-30s, around 35%. And this actually is not generally true of meaningful use criteria. What I mean is that when there is a threshold, which there is for every meaningful use criteria, you actually usually see most hospitals in the 80–90% range, because it's actually harder to meet a criteria at a lower threshold, right? To say, well, I'm only going to do CPOE for 60% of my patients as opposed to all my patients, right? It's actually harder to do it at 60% than it is just to say, well, this is our new standard of practice, right? But this pattern looks really different for this HIE criteria. And I think, again, that tells us something, that we're dealing with a different beast here. This is not the same as the other criteria in which we're trying to sort of, fully change behavior, and it's harder to do less. Here with health information exchange, I actually think it's harder to do more. And so we're facing a different set of issues. This graph alone then made me interested, and I'm going to show you later on in my presentation a study that we just finished that's going to be coming out in a couple months that said, well, what explains this variation? Because clearly you can see on this graph that there are some hospitals that are up in the 70, 80, 90% range. So I wanted to know, who are they? Who are the hospitals that have been able to get to those higher numbers, and what are they doing? So I'm going to show you those results in a minute. But again, I think the key takeaway from this slide is that even though many hospitals are able to meet this criteria, most of them are not exchanging summary of care records electronically on a routine basis. So this is I'm not a clinician, so this is the closest I'm going to get to a diagnosis of anything. But my diagnosis for why we've seen this slow progress is really the confluence of three factors. The first is little clarity and agreement around the endpoint. When do we plant the flag and say, victory, we have interoperability? We've used interoperability in this room in the last day and a bit, hundreds of times, if not more. And I think in our minds, we actually each think about something a little bit different when we talk about it. Are we talking about transmitting a CCD? Are we talking about e-prescribing? Right? Interoperability is not one thing. And as a country, there's not really been a clear statement of this is interoperability. This is what we're all aiming towards. And when you think about the many efforts that are trying to pursue interoperability, if we're not all aiming at the same target, it actually makes it much harder to achieve effective coordinated action. So that's, I think, the first challenge, is that we've sort of been pursuing a big, complex, multi-component target, and without that clarity on the endpoint, it actually makes it, I think, harder to make rapid progress. The second issue is that we're really facing numerous difficult barriers that span domains. If interoperability, I think, were just a technical issue, or just a legal issue, or just an anything issue, it would make it much easier. But it's really all of the above. It's hard to think about a barrier in the health IT space that doesn't apply to interoperability. And so we're facing a large array of barriers, but we're also, when we look at what does it take to tackle those barriers, it requires coordinated action across a diverse set of stakeholders: payers, providers, policymakers, and in some cases even patients. And getting coordinated action across such a diverse set of stakeholders is also just a very hard task. And third, and what I'm going to spend the most time today talking about, is that there's just been insufficiently strong financial incentives to overcome those barriers, right? When you're faced with a tough problem and you need stakeholders to come together and work on it, they need to have strong incentives to do that hard work. And I think to date, we just have not had those strong incentives. And for me, the litmus test has been, if I walked into a provider organization, or if I walked into an EHR vendor and I said, do you think you will be in business this time next year if you don't figure out how to solve interoperability? I think most of them would say, I will still be in business next year if I don't figure this out. And that just gives you a sense of where the incentives are, where the calibration is. Most of them, I think, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, feel that it's important, it's a priority, but it is not my top priority. It's probably not even maybe a top 5 priority. So I know I need to do it, but it's not going to be at the top of my list. So I think if we want to make more rapid progress, we need to move interoperability up the priority list, and we do that through financial incentives. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these in detail, but as I said, spend the most time on this last bullet. So, this question, I think, of clarity on the endpoint is actually a really tough one, because there's this tension between well-defined use cases, which, again, we've talked about a lot in this room, and I think everyone can wrap their heads around a well-defined use case. But if all we do is pursue individual use cases, you may miss the opportunity to achieve, I think, what we also agree is the end goal, which is being able to share all relevant health information in an interoperable manner. And so it becomes this challenge of how do we pick off and pursue these use cases, set near-term goals in a way that at the end of the day gets us to where we want to be. And again, I think Michigan has been pretty exemplary in this approach, being able to build infrastructure that supports multiple use cases, and I think eventually will get us there, but also say, well, this is the use case that we're going to take on one at a time, and sort of be able to make those incremental steps in a way that everyone understands that we're making progress towards use case A or use case B or use case C, but that eventually at the end of all this, we will get to a state in which we're able to get to the Holy Grail. And again, I think as a country, we have not done that. We have sort of used this loose definition of we just want to share all information in an interoperable manner, and that's made it very hard to make progress because the question is, well, what are the steps that we take to get there? So in terms of these, difficult barriers and the ones and barriers that require multi-stakeholder coordination, I'm just going to show you some data. One of the sort of core areas of my research has been to conduct national surveys of health information exchange organizations and statewide efforts. So folks like Tim get a lot of surveys from me, and he diligently fills them out. So thank you. And so one of the questions we always ask is, what are the barriers to your progress? And you're not going to be able to read this, but I'm going to sort of call them out. I think the first thing to notice is how many barriers. More than 60% of respondents said this is a tough barrier, right? Like, who wants a job in which I tell you these are this many barriers you're going to need to come in and solve on a day-to-day basis if you want to make progress. And so again, I think it just gives us a sense of how hard it is to make one of these efforts successful, because there are so many barriers that really are difficult to address. But if you actually look at the detail in this list, which I said I'll walk you through, you get a sense for just, again, that this is not just one barrier that has multiple components to it. These are very distinct types of barriers. So the first is barriers related to the business case and incentives. So this first one is competition from other HIE efforts, right? We're in a space now where there are enough of these efforts that are operating in the same geography that there's a perception that they're actually competing with each other to sign up providers, right? So that's one form of competition that's actually been a more recent challenge that I think maybe we didn't anticipate. For so long we said, well, we need more of these efforts, and now we're saying, wait, maybe we have too many of them. So that's one challenge. Stakeholder concerns about their competitive position, the competitive implications of sharing information with each other, lack of stakeholder interest, competition from health IT vendors that are offering HIE solutions, lack of funding, and developing a sustainable business model, right? So one set of barriers that are all sort of pointing to this challenge of how do I create a business case for myself and a sustainability model. Technical challenges, linking patient data and patient matching, addressing other technical barriers, lack of resources to implement interface standards, and the limitations of current interface standards to support needed use cases, right? So again, real technical challenges that are on this list as well. Barriers related to policy and governance challenges, agreement on what HIE includes. This is sort of the first barrier I talked about, like what even are we trying to build and support here? Privacy and confidentiality concerns, governance issues, managing complexity of consent models, and meeting government and policy mandates, right? So again, another really challenging set of barriers. And then just some basic operational challenges. The number one barrier on this list is hiring and retaining staff. How do I find people who know how to be in the HIE business? And I think that's why it's encouraging to see so many interns up here too, right? Because we need a workforce who understands these issues and can take us into the next era of health information exchange. And integration of HIE into provider workflow, right? Again, a very different challenge, but one that's also makes it very hard on a day-to-day basis to show that we're delivering value. So again, if you ask me, like, do I want a job with this set of barriers, I would say that sounds like a really hard job. And those are just a complex set of barriers that, again, can't be solved by any single organization. And so it really, I think, gives a sense for the challenge that we're up against as we think about making progress. Okay, but as I said, I want to spend the most time on this last bucket, because if we're going to solve those barriers, if we're going to get stakeholders to the table to figure out how to solve those, we, I think, have to strengthen the incentives to do so. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what we know. I think the first sign, at least for me, that this was going to be an issue, and again, that, that we could sing kumbaya, but the business decisions that were getting made behind closed doors had a slightly different tone to them, was a study that came out in 2008 in which hospital leaders were interviewed about their decisions to engage in health information exchange. And there was a quote from a hospital CEO that said that he perceived data, quote, as a key strategic asset tying physicians and patients to their organization. Right? And that's, again, shouldn't have been surprising, and makes total sense, right? But that, again, this is back in 2008, that this was sort of the first kernel of sense that, you're going to now ask the CEO to share that data. I mean, why in the heck would he do that? More recently, again, in sort of what I think of as the anecdotal evidence bucket, we've seen complaints to ONC about information blocking. And again, hard to know, are those sort of one-off bad apple cases, or is that a more systematic set of issues that's more pervasive? So I have now set off to sort of move beyond anecdotal evidence and to gather some more systematic evidence. And so a study I did back in 2011 just looked at, well, what types of hospitals are participating in health information exchange? And here we found that for-profit hospitals and hospitals in more competitive markets were less likely to engage. So again, on the evidence spectrum, one step up to say, well, across the nation, we do systematically see patterns of hospitals not participating who seem to be more sensitive to concerns about competition. But I personally was not satisfied stopping there. I wanted to get, again, sort of even more of a sense of what was going on with these issues around competition and incentives. And so I want to tell you about two specific studies. The first one I mentioned earlier is trying to explain what is that variation in terms of the percent of summary of care records that are able to be transmitted electronically. That paper will be coming out in, I think, a month or so. So you're getting an advanced peek into it. And the second study came out a few months ago, and it was really, I think, the first study to say, is this information blocking thing real? And we surveyed the leaders of HIE efforts across the country and asked them, is this something that you think is real? So I'll show you that data as well. So again, the first study was basically just saying, I just want to explain this variation, help me understand why some hospitals are at 10, 11, 12%, and others are at 80, 90, upwards of 100%. And so what we did is we looked at characteristics in buckets of technology and incentives, and then sort of a bunch of other variables we didn't quite know how to bucket. And so in the technology bucket, what we found, again, this is using national hospital data. So this is all hospitals that attested to stage 2 meaningful use. And so what we found is the characteristics of hospitals that were doing more, and the numbers in parentheses say sort of how much more were hospitals with that characteristic doing, controlling for all the other factors. So hospitals that were using a third-party HIE vendor were doing 2.6 percentage point higher electronic exchange of summary of care records. So again, it gives you a sense for the magnitude of the effect. And all of these are pretty small magnitude effects. None of these were explaining who was doing 10% versus 90%. So these were sort of little gains. Hospitals that were using an EHR vendor as their HIE vendor, 3 percentage points higher. Hospitals that were able to send electronic alerts to primary care providers, another sort of proxy measure perhaps for their HIE sophistication. And then hospitals that were using specific EHR vendors seemed to do better. So hospitals that were using Epic did about 7 percentage point higher, and hospitals that were using Siemens. And in this data, Cerner fared less well. So hospitals that were using Cerner were doing a little bit lower. So they were doing about 4 percentage points lower. And this is not an indictment of a vendor. This is just correlations. But again, it gives you a sense that there might be something to do with just the vendor capabilities that are impacting this. Some of the factors that were not associated that we thought might be were participating in a health information exchange organization. And again, I think that's partly because these organizations support a range of use cases, not necessarily this one specific meaningful use case. Surprisingly, the sort of how sophisticated their EHR was didn't matter. So it didn't matter if they had a more basic or a more comprehensive EHR. And also somewhat surprisingly, the number of available exchange partners in the market didn't seem to matter. So we looked at other hospitals in the market that were ready to do stage 2 meaningful use, and that didn't seem to matter. On the incentive side, we found, again, some characteristics that were related. So government hospitals were doing about 8 percentage points higher, so that was one of the bigger magnitude effects we found, as well as nonprofit hospitals were doing a little bit more, so that's compared to for-profit hospitals. So again, we're starting to see some of this competitive implications filter into the data. For-profit hospitals, then by definition, were doing less than their government and nonprofit counterparts. And hospitals that were part of systems were doing somewhat more, again, 3.5 percentage points. But interestingly, some of the factors that we had found in our prior research were not associated. So the level of market competition was not associated with the level of exchange. Hospital market share, network membership, the percent of revenue in capitated contracts or in shared risk contracts also didn't matter. So again, this is early data, so it may be that some of these just take more time to mature, but we didn't see, again, any of those other measures that were related. Then we looked at just, again, as I said, a bunch of other measures that didn't fit as cleanly into a technology bucket or an incentives bucket. Somewhat surprisingly, rural hospitals were doing a somewhat higher percent of exchange. And compared to small non-teaching hospitals, large minor teaching hospitals and large major teaching hospitals were doing less. And I think that there's a complexity story here, that large teaching hospitals are just getting patients from a lot of different places. And so to get to a higher threshold of exchange is just a much harder task than when you're a smaller hospital and not working with as many partners. But there were a lot of other factors, again, that were not associated. So the percent of Medicare or Medicaid volume that you had, if you were located in a micropolitan location, so it was only rural compared to metropolitan that mattered. Whether your sort of degree of hospital ambulatory integration, the market population, or hospital beds per 1,000 residents. So again, it's sort of a mixed bag, right? You look at these factors and you say, there's a lot going on here, right? It's not just one set of factors that seems like really explains which hospitals were able to get to this higher percent of exchange. One of the factors that we thought about in this study is, again, that primary, that blue graph I showed you was of all your care transitions, for what percent of them do you electronically transmit a summary of care record? But we thought, well, how do you know that that's really about the exchange piece, the electronic exchange piece? There's actually quite a lot more than just the exchange itself that goes into meeting that criteria. You need to be able to generate a summary of care record. You need to know where that record needs to go. And those are things, that are not sort of particularly focused on just that electronic transmission piece. So as a sort of additional analysis in this paper, we looked at, what is related to, of all the summary of care records that you generate, the percent that are transmitted electronically. So it's a subtle difference, but it gets a little bit, I think, more sharply to this question of what is actually going into the exchange piece. And then it allows us to say, well, of all the variables that seem to matter in the prior analysis, which ones persist when we're looking at this measure that I think is particularly sensitive to your ability to do electronic exchange. And here, 3 of those variables persisted, having Epic compared to another vendor, being a government or nonprofit hospital, and being part of a system. So if you said to me, what are the factors that really tell you about whether a hospital is able to do a higher level of electronic transmission, taking out all the other things that go into being able to generate and send a summary of care record, these would be the 3. And again, I think what's tricky about these is that they're not telling you one thing, right? This is not just about technology. This is not just about incentives. This is about some combination of factors that, again, make if you said to me, well, I need to figure out how to get everyone to 100%, I would say, well, this list makes it hard for me to know what to do, especially because the answer is clearly not going to be, get everyone on one vendor or force everyone to join a system. So I think, again, the key takeaways from this are, first of all, just that we did see an overall low level of HIE under stage 2 meaningful use. So as a sort of policy effort, it's been, I think, moderately helpful at increasing exchange, but it's not gotten us to the finish line. If we look at then what explains that variation, it is, I think, related to both technology capabilities and incentives, and some degree of just complexity based on the type of hospital you are and your patient mix. But that again makes it sort of hard to know, well, what are the clear targets for action to increase exchange? And again, I think it doesn't give us a huge amount of new insights into the incentive challenges, because it still continues to say, well, there seem like there are these underlying incentive factors, but not directly what you would need to do to change those incentives. So I think a more helpful study in terms of thinking about policy actions is thinking about this concept of information blocking. And I think it's been a very polarizing topic. And I think it's also been a very misunderstood topic in a lot of ways, because it's been interpreted as, any time that, that we're sort of not doing full interoperability, we're going to be accused of information blocking. And that's actually not the definition and not the construct. And so I think part of this is just understanding when we say information blocking, what do we actually mean? But the reason that I found information blocking to be such an important concept, and why I'm personally, from a, I think, policy perspective, very glad that we're talking about it, is that it differentiates weak incentives from perverse incentives. And those are really important to distinguish, because under weak incentives, stakeholders want to pursue interoperability. It's perhaps just not at the top of their list. Under perverse incentives, you actually want to actively interfere with interoperability. When there's opportunities to engage in it, you want to not do them and do everything you can to stop them. And those are two very different scenarios to be in. And if information blocking is a real thing, it says, no, these incentives are actually perverse. As opposed to, if we don't see evidence of information blocking, it suggests, no, just the incentives are weak and we need to focus on strengthening them. And so really, until we had this concept, we hadn't had that conversation around which incentive scenario are we in. And so again, even though I think it's been a polarizing topic, I think it's been useful to really dig into the incentives in a little bit more detail. And so again, if incentives are perverse, we should be hearing, no, this information blocking thing really is real, and we need to then tackle that problem in a somewhat different way. But again, if the incentives are just weak, then information blocking is likely more of a bad apple problem. There are just a few people who are doing this, and really what we need to do is just focus on strengthening our current set of incentives, as opposed to fundamentally changing them because they are currently perverse. So this is the official ONC definition of information blocking. And as I said, if you actually read this definition carefully, it's quite a high bar to actually be engaging in information blocking. So it's basically interference with exchange that's done with knowledge that you're doing it. So you actually need to sort of say, well, I knew I could have done A, but I chose to do B. And that by making that explicit and knowing choice, that you are sort of harming the public policy goals, which is to sort of promote an environment in which information can flow across provider organizations. So that, I think, is actually quite a hard thing to prove, because how do you prove that knowledge existed? I mean, that is sort of when you're in the world of court cases and legal disclosures. And so I don't think anyone can look at an organization and sort of just say from the outside, oh no, they are doing information blocking, right? You don't actually know whether they had that knowledge or whether they didn't. So that's, again, why I think that this concept has oftentimes been taken and applied more broadly than it should have. But again, as currently defined, information blocking is really only observed through provider and or vendor business practices. And again, I have no data set of those business practices, so I can't look at them and say, oh yes, they are doing information blocking or they are not. And so I was trying to figure out, well, so how can we figure out if this is real or not? And so what I realized is that, who most directly observes vendor and provider business practices around information exchange? Those are health information exchange efforts, right? They are out there on the front lines every day trying to get these organizations to participate, and they see those business practices. And so that was what led me to decide, well, let's do a national survey of HIE leaders and ask them whether they think this is real or not. And also ask them about what they think some of the policy solutions might be. So now I'll just walk you through the results of that survey. So these percents are always percents of HIE leaders who felt this. So this is not the percent of vendors. This is not 55% of vendors are engaging in information blocking. This is 55% of HIE leaders across the country told us that EHR vendors were routinely engaging in information blocking. 30% of them said, nope, it's not routine, it's occasional. And 15% of HIE leaders said, nope, this is rare. We also asked about hospitals and health systems. We decided not to do providers because providers are such a heterogeneous category, and it's hard to sort of think about the small independent practice as engaging in the same business practices as large hospitals and health systems. So we just focused on hospitals and health systems, also because that's where there had been some of these more anecdotal reports of information blocking was really among hospitals and health systems. So here you can see the results were lower. Fewer HIE leaders said that these provider organizations were engaging in information blocking routinely. That was about a quarter. But again, a quarter is not trivial either. So again, just gives us a sense for the extent to which this is perceived as happening across the nation. We then wanted to know, well, what are the specific forms of information blocking that are being observed by these HIE leaders? And so the most common one by EHR vendors was high fees for HIE that seemed to be unrelated to the actual cost of implementing that functionality. And you can see about 50% of our respondents said this is done often or routinely, and then another 40% said sometimes. The next most prevalent option was making third-party access to standardized data difficult. The next is refusing to support HIE with specific vendors or HIE efforts. And then you can see some of these sort of less frequent actions were making data difficult to export, changing HIE contract terms post-implementation, and unfavorable contract terms for HIE. We asked similarly for hospitals and health systems, what are the most common forms of information blocking? And again, we gave them these answer choices, so this was not free text. And we came up with the list actually based on consulting with ONC and some others who had been getting these reports about what are these specific forms. And so again, you can see that these were all about evenly reported. The first was coercing providers to adopt particular EHR HIE technology. The second was controlling patient flow by selectively sharing patient information, so saying I will share with you, but I won't share with you. And then the third one was using HIPAA as a barrier to share PHI when in fact, I think probably everyone in this room, I'm seeing heads nodding, knows that it's not. It actually was intended to promote information sharing. So again, overall, we're just seeing less reporting of these specific forms, but again, each one of these was reported at about 25% occurring routinely. So we then asked about policy strategies to combat information blocking. What did our respondents think would be the most effective policy strategies? So what you may see in the middle here that jumps out at you is what I think of as our most polarizing policy option, which had the most people saying it was very effective, but also a lot of people saying it was going to be ineffective, which is making information blocking illegal. So that, again, is probably one of the strongest policy actions that could be taken is to make it illegal such that there could be, civil prosecution. And so, again, a lot of people thought that was a great idea, but also a lot of people thought that was a really terrible idea. So that was sort of why it ended up in the middle. The ones where there was more agreement that it was either very effective or moderately effective was better demonstration of product interoperability. And if you then look, so this, we shared this sort of as 21st century cures was getting developed, and I think if you look at the trust IT provisions, that is, front and center there is just more transparency on these issues. Prohibiting gag clauses around providers to being able to talk about vendor system performance. Stronger government investment in HIE infrastructure was next, and then sort of the next was making information blocking illegal, and then stronger financial incentives, tougher certification, and some kind of voluntary code of conduct, which again would probably be one of the weakest policy responses is something voluntary. And again, so this not surprisingly was not perceived as particularly effective. On the hospital and health system side, again, here you saw that same trend with making information blocking illegal, but it's even more extreme that, about 60% of people thought it would be very effective and almost the remaining 40% thought it would not be at all effective. And so again, that sort of dichotomous response to that particular option. But the more popular options were stronger incentives for CMS to engage in interoperability, increasing transparency in business practices, and some of the sort of less popular options were just more guidance from ONC on what to do, training providers to identify information blocking, and creation of a provider code of conduct. So again, gives us a sense for what some of the policy responses may be effective. So again, what do we conclude from this? What I take away from it is that information blocking appears to be real, which means that there are actual efforts to impede information exchange that could otherwise occur, which I think of as harmful. But it's not routine among all vendors and providers. So this is happening, and it's happening on a large enough scale that we need to be worried about it, but it's not sort of the norm everywhere, which again, from a policy perspective, makes it a little bit tough, because the question is, well, then how do we know how to pursue policy efforts that target where it is happening, but not harm places where it's not happening? But the policy actions that were to combat it, I think, are things that are just generally useful for the industry. So things like strengthening incentives, but in particular increasing transparency, and transparency on a range of dimensions, on pricing, on contracting, product performance. And I think we haven't really done much in the transparency space, and so 21st Century Cures really has the potential to change that. And there is specific funding that is dedicated to developing measures that should give us more transparency, at least on the EHR vendor side, around interoperability performance. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty about whether that will happen, what it will look like, but I think that there is a real opportunity to use that particular market lever that's going to be spurred by a policy effort to generate those measures. And so I think if we do see better measures out there, it might not change a purchasing decision per se, but it'll allow providers to go to their vendors, and again, to the extent that providers want this, and say, listen, we see that you're not performing well on these measures, and create some pressure on vendors that hasn't really had at least as strong of a basis to exist without these measures. So again, to sort of step back from these individual studies and their conclusions, I think, to my mind, again, sort of they reinforce this notion that we still don't have enough clarity on the endpoint that we're trying to aim towards as a country, that we are still wrestling with a lot of difficult barriers and how to get that coordinated action across stakeholders, but really that we continue to see, I think, pretty compelling evidence that just the incentive piece is not there. And I'm personally skeptical that we're going to solve issues 1 or 2 without much stronger incentives. And so I think, going forward, we need to think about achieving this sweet spot in which the provider side has much stronger incentives, either directly for interoperability, but personally, I'm more in favor of the idea of incentivizing outcomes that we care about, that we believe cannot be achieved effectively without good health information exchange. So we're not paying directly for moving data from point A to point B, but we're paying for the outcomes we care about in a way where we all believe, well, you just can't achieve that outcome without those measures. And I'll talk a minute about why I think we're actually going to make some progress on identifying what those measures may be. And I think we need to still work on lowering barriers to interoperability, and I think in particular targeting some of the vendor and technology issues, as well as some of the legal and regulatory issues. But if you said today, what are the size of these arrows, right? I would say the incentive arrow is actually quite small, and the arrow on the right is quite big. So what we need to get to is a state in which these arrows are sort of equally big, and being able to sort of point towards this sweet spot. So where are some of the opportunities on either side here? I'll actually start with on the right. I think we are seeing stage 3 and API requirements, again, we've talked about here, as an opportunity to try to lower the barriers, make it easier to exchange information. And so we'll, again, in the next year or 2, we'll have a much better sense for how what that's going to look like in practice. As I mentioned before, the trust provisions within 21st Century Cures, again, I think give us an opportunity to improve some of the sort of technology pieces by having much more transparency around what that product performance actually looks like. And then there's a range of federal efforts that we heard about yesterday related to removing some of the policy barriers related to sort of consent, patient matching, et cetera. So again, those are all what I think of as like barrier reduction strategies, and there has been and continues to be a lot of effort there. And in general, I think that's a good thing, but there are times when, again, I think that side of the list can feel very heavy. If you look at the other side, one of the options, that's on the table, and as of now, in stage 3 meaningful use, the HIE criteria threshold will raise from 10% to 50%. So maybe, again, that will be enough to really sort of push us towards even higher levels. Though, again, based on the data I showed you today, I'm skeptical. So we could think about, as a policy strategy, raising that even higher, beyond 50%. There's a new National Quality Forum effort to develop and identify outcome measures that are sensitive to health information exchange. That framework is actually out for public comment right now, and it closes on June 30th. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested to take a look at those measures. And I think if we can do a good job of identifying what some of those outcome measures are that are sensitive to health information exchange, then we can start to build those into payment models. And that, I think, personally, is going to really be the path forward here. If providers are on the hook for measures where they can see this directly requires me to engage in higher levels of exchange. So I would encourage you to take a look at that framework and see which measures you think are good. If there are other measures that should be on that list and aren't, please weigh in with those. Again, I think we can then incorporate these measures into some of the new payment models that we're experimenting with. I think the other incentive driver that we're seeing is a shift to bundled payment, and there's certainly more interest in exchange among hospitals that are now participating in bundled payment, and we're just starting some of the research to determine if that's true, but anecdotally I've certainly heard a lot of hospitals that are thinking a lot more seriously about exchanging with long-term care providers now that they're on the hook for that acute and post-acute care bundle. So again, I think we're starting to see some movement on the incentive side, but I still worry about whether it's enough. Is it enough, again, to make interoperability a stay-in-business issue? And that, I think, for me, will continue to be the litmus test, and I think we're perhaps working towards that, but not where we need to be in terms of strength of incentives. So, I think option 2, if that strategy doesn't work, is just to make the rest of the country look like Michigan. And so, so again, we have 2 options, and, either one will work well. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions now. Again, I know you're also tweeting them, so either is fine, but according to this clock, we have 1 minute and 35 seconds left.
Well, you got the mic? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the flattering comments on Michigan, too. In your studies, did you see a dynamic at all between the hospital reinforcing the vendor relationship? Because it's sort of been my opinion that the customer of the HR vendor has not made it a priority, and so they've kind of had this symbiotic, relationship where then it's not been a priority for the HR vendor. Yeah. And was that picked up at all?
Yeah, so as you may recall, Tim, we had lunch and I showed you my survey and you said you need to add a question about that. And I think, honestly, you are a more sophisticated respondent than most. We asked that question and most people said don't know. So I think the answer is it may be happening, but there was just not enough comfort among the respondent pool to really sort of be able to observe that dynamic. But I share your opinion that is what's going on. I think the vendors are listening to their clients in terms of their priorities, and they're just not hearing that this is a priority.
We do have a little bit of extra time because we got started early. So we've got another question right here. We have about 8 minutes, but as we mentioned, anyone who wants to tweet questions as well, Julie will be answering those also. And then here's this question.
With your work with surveying across the nation with different HIEs, and certainly we heard yesterday from the standpoint of Connecticut that does not have an HIE to increase, which we've seen in the last couple of years, increased competition with HIEs. What was your experience with anecdotal evidence besides the survey instrument on how that helped or hindered data flow?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think mostly what we heard is that this is happening, and that that HIEs were going after the same providers, and providers were feeling frustrated because it was, they sort of felt like, well, I just want one, right? I don't want to have to pick and sort of think about, well, what are the implications of picking A versus B? So it felt like both the HIEs were frustrated and the providers were frustrated. But I think it's been part of the challenge of pursuing HIE as a market-based strategy, is that we are telling each of them to go out and get as many customers as you can. And so I think it's sort of one of the inherent tensions in the current approach that we've taken to HIE, and I think a more savvy state will think about that issue in advance. So if I don't know if Alan is here again today, but I think you don't want to end up in a situation like that, and so you need to think about either sort of geographic boundaries that will prevent that, or service level boundaries. And I think we've seen that in Michigan as well, where we have 2 HIEs in this state, but they've gone after sort of very different approaches to HIE that allows a provider to say, I can see value in both of those approaches. And again, I think there's still some tensions in that model. And even in the geographic boundary model, it's not perfect. But if we're not going to say there's going to be a single statewide HIE, which most states have not been willing to say, they want to take a more market-based approach, I think we just need to be aware of and manage those tensions, and that's something that I think would be a good role for a state to play.
Thank you so much. Very extraordinary results, and the things that you looked at are hugely powerful. And part of your rationale in surveying HIEs was that they're on the ground trying to figure out how to share data. I'm curious if you might do a follow-up study with consumers who are also trying to get access to their data and maybe having less success than in the HIE world.
Yeah, so that's a great idea, and I think it would sort of reveal a different set of information blocking issues, because they're sort of blocking provider to provider, but then there's also been blocking provider to patient, and so that I think would reveal a different set of issues. So that's a great idea. Pardon? And incentives might be different, yeah, absolutely. But I think, if you talk, I've been on many panels with these patient advocates, and they explain what they have to go through to get their own medical records, and I think it's clear that maybe it's even worse in that scenario. So thank you, that's a terrific suggestion.
Tom Simmer from Blue Cross. I certainly agree that, and we use liberally incentives to get people to engage more fully in health information exchange. But I was wondering, what was the reason why you didn't mention mandates in terms of requiring various specs in these health records, so that we can count on them having certain capabilities? I think of that as being an approach that might supplement incentives, and I think there's probably a reason why you didn't mention it, and I was wondering what it might be.
Yeah, so I think we had an option in there that was something about government mandates, but it wasn't as specific about government mandates for technical standards, and I think part of the reason was because we sort of felt like we had that today, right? We have, meaningful use is really it's not a mandate, because you can still, there's voluntary participation in the program, but that is a requirement around a set of technical standards and sort of a level of use of those standards. So I think the sense was we know how far meaningful use has gotten us, and on the hospital side, it's actually gotten us quite far in terms of the percent of hospitals that are able to meet those specs. But I think your point is also sometimes that even when we mandate specifications, there are ways to game it, but there are also ways to just perhaps not put as much effort as you need to make those specifications work as designed. And I think the challenge there is is that information blocking or not? And again, it could be, but it could not be. So it was a little bit more of a gray area, I think, in the information blocking space. So anyway, so I think that gives you, I hope, a little bit of sense for sort of how we thought about that issue, and I think it felt a little bit more familiar. But there are also ways in which that could be a really powerful lever. I think especially if we could incentivize not just the current certification framework, which I think doesn't go far enough to really assess whether the technical standards are being implemented in a way that makes interoperability effective. So that we probably should have asked that.
We have time for just 1 or 2 quick questions.
Yeah, hi, Jeff Livesey at MyHin. I was thrilled by your presentation, great stuff, but I was very intrigued by your comment about 2 HIEs in Michigan. And when we present the network of networks for Michigan, we actually show 13. And I think all 13 of the HIEs in Michigan are in the room. So I want to make sure that we don't want to mischaracterize that. Did you mean 2 types of HIEs?
Yes.
Because those 13 are connected into one network, and that's MyHin. So we're more of a network than an HIE.
Yes. So sorry, absolutely. I meant 2 types. What I think of is the community HIE or HIO, and then the statewide. So thank you. That's a really important.
Thank you for clarifying. Thank you.
clarification.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much in the back here. Thank you. So the carrot and stick approach has really, in many respects, failed us when it comes to interoperability, and frankly ossified or more kind of solidified a lot of the problems that you spoke to so well today. And I'm wondering, as a provider, because there are also issues of data quality and usability and other important elements of HIE. And I'm wondering if, as an end game, another approach might be to tap into the latent desires of patients and providers, really what this is ultimately all about, to give them relevant and meaningful information. And like an iPhone, which doesn't require us to be incented to purchase, I think that providers are more than willing to embrace technology when it works and when it provides meaningful tools in that doctor-patient relationship. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that potential kind of leverage instrument to kind of move us to where we want to be.
Yeah. So I think part of the challenge, maybe this should be a fourth arm to my diagnosis, has been a real disconnect between the frontline providers and patients and the people who are making decisions about interoperability, who are largely not those groups. And so I think there has been a lot of discussion about, can we move to a model in which sort of providers and patients are much more at the center and driving things. And I think there's two reasons to think that we're going to at least have the option to do that moving forward. I think, one is that we are pushing the ability for patients to, download and transmit their own information. So they will, I think, for the first time, have some tools to really be at the center of managing their own information. I personally am skeptical about whether that alone is going to get us there. I think many patients don't want that task and just want their providers to figure it out. And so I'm skeptical about whether all but sort of a small group of activated patients are really going to sort of take up those tools and move the interoperability ball forward. But I think in terms of engaging frontline providers, I mean, I think if we're successful with APIs and opening up our current EHR ecosystem, it will create more, the possibility for an app-like approach where providers can say, this is the data I want, this is how I want to interact with it, and can be much more in the driver's seat in a way we just haven't allowed them to before because the decisions weren't getting made at that level. So again, I think there are some reasons to think that's not going to happen in the next year or two. I think there's even the API requirements are still fairly vendor-specific. That's going to make it hard to easily pull data from multiple EHRs all at once. But I think we're going to start to take some steps where we'll at least see whether those tools are taken up by those groups, and if that latent demand is there, then I think that will be a successful strategy. So I think we just haven't tried it to date, so it's sort of hard to know. But I think we all agree that it's worth trying because those are the groups who want this data, and it'll make their lives and their jobs easier. So stay tuned is maybe the best answer I can give. Good. Thank you so much.